Welcome, everyone, to this recording of the Scarlet Ibis. Um, as I just said, this is the Scarlet Ibis. So this recording will cover the first half of the short story, about 50-60%, and then we'll finish the rest in class on Thursday and have a little discussion about some of the themes. So without further ado, we'll cover one of the big questions of this story. We'll look at some background of the author, and then we will start reading the story. I'll pause it every now and then to explain some certain things, and then we will continue from there. So one of the biggest questions of the Scarlet Ibis is, why do we hurt the ones we love? It's kind of ironic. The people that we live with, our family, are supposed to be the ones that love us and protect us the best. And yet sometimes our family can be the people who hurt us the worst. And so that is something that happens to literally everyone. And we have to wonder, why does that happen? So let's read this paragraph here. Cruelty can intrude on the most loving relationship, often in moments of anger or disappointment. How do you deal with mixed emotions like these? Adults usually control such urges, but children are more likely to act in their immediate feelings, as we'll see in our story today. What harm can come from a thoughtless word or action? Sometimes we're harder on loved ones than anyone else. Why do you think that is? Interesting questions to think about and ponder as we read through this. So a little bit about our author of this story, James Hurst. He was a man of many colors. He was in the military during World War II. He studied singing at Juilliard, which is this crazy school that produces a lot of incredible musicians. And then in 1951, he started a career as a banker at a large New York bank. Then he published his story in 1960, and it was a huge success. And he just continued to work at the bank and write every now and then. So let's talk about the setting. The setting of the Scarlet Ibis takes place in North Carolina during the late 1910s. So during this time, World War I is just starting and panning out. So World War I is occurring. And the Scarlet Ibis, the titular bird, is a tropical bird. So it doesn't really appear in North Carolina unless it's blown off course by a storm or it's sick. So that's a little bit about the story, a little bit about the theme. So let's hop into this story, The Scarlet Ibis by James Hurst. Actually, before we continue, let me zoom in on this. There we go. It was in a clove of seasons. Summer was dead, but autumn had not yet been born, that the ibis lit in the bleeding tree. The flower garden was stained with rotting brown magnolia petals, and iron weeds grew rank amid the purple phlox. The 5 o'clocks by the chimney still marked time, but the oriole nest in the elm was untenanted and rocked back and forth like an empty cradle. The last graveyard flowers were blooming, and their smell drifted across the cotton field and through every room of our house, speaking softly the names of the dead. It's strange that all this is still so clear to me, now that the summer has long since fled and time has had its way. A grindstone stands where the bleeding tree stood, just outside the kitchen door, and now if an oriole sings in the elm, its song seems to die up in the leaves, a silvery dust. The flower garden is prim, the house a gleaming white, and the pale fence across the yard stands straight and spruce. But sometimes, like right now, as I sit in the cool green-draped parlor, the grindstone begins to turn, and time with all its changes is ground away, and I remember Doodle. Okay. So real quick here, I just want to pause and talk about this first section. So we've talked before about how the descriptions that an author uses will help create the mood of a story. So in the example that we went over, a month ago now, of the girl sitting in her backyard. One of the descriptions had the smell of barbecue, the light warming her skin, playing through the trees, hearing her friends calling her, and that was good. And the other example of the exact same scenario, we had the sun burning her skin, scorching the grass, screams of children, all the same things, just described in a negative way. That is exactly what James Hurst is doing in this first paragraph. Look at the description. Summer was dead. It's a weird way of saying that summer is over. So why didn't he just say that? Maybe he wants to create a certain mood. The flower garden was stained with rotting brown magnolia petals. Iron weeds grew rank amid the purple phlox. So instead of a bright, beautiful, lush garden, it's decomposing, it's withered, it's sick. Oriole nest, untenanted, so empty nest. Empty cradle, so instead of life and excitement and sound, all the things are empty. Graveyard flowers. There's a lot of other types of flowers, so why'd you choose the one that's associated with death? The smell drifted across the cotton field and through every room of our house, speaking softly the names of our dead. The oriole song dying up in the leaves. So all of these descriptions, the death, the rotting, the emptiness, it's all creating a very sad mood. And we have to ask ourselves, why is the author doing that? So those are a couple of ways that the author really helps create this mood. So let's keep going. Doodle was just about the craziest brother a boy ever had. Of course, he wasn't a crazy like old Miss Leedy, who was in love with President Wilson and wrote him a letter every day, but was a nice crazy, like someone you meet in your dreams. He was born when I was 6 and was, from the outset, a disappointment. He seemed all head, with a tiny body which was red and shriveled like an old man's. Everybody thought he was going to die. Everybody except Aunt Nicey, who had delivered him. She said he would live because he was born in a caul, and cauls were made from Jesus' nightgown. So cauls are, if you look down here, cauls are just a thin membrane that some babies are born in. Daddy had Mr. Heath, the carpenter, build a little mahogany coffin for him. But he didn't die. And when he was 3 months old, Mama and Daddy decided they might as well name him. They named him William Armstrong, which was like tying a big tail on a small kite. Such a name sounds good only on a tombstone. So that's a very interesting quote, and I want you to take a guess as to what it means. So thinking about the description of Doodle when he's born, he's like got a big head, tiny red, wrinkled body like an old man's. He's really sickly. Why does the name William Armstrong seem like tying a big tail on a small kite? Give it a guess. Okay, so hopefully you had an opportunity to take a guess as to what that meant. And so the way that it is interpreted is William Armstrong. This big, strong, courageous, aggressive name. That's a name you give to explorers and astronauts and Olympians. William Armstrong. Such a strong name given to such a sickly, weak little boy. Just seems like that name is too big for Doodle's small body. So that's what he means. So going back to the story. I thought myself pretty smart at many things, like holding my breath, running, jumping, or climbing the vines in Old Woman Swamp. And I wanted, more than anything else, someone to race to Horsehead Landing, someone to box with, and someone to perch with in the top fork of the great pine behind the barn, where across the fields and swamps you could see the sea. I wanted a brother. But Mama, crying, told me that even if William Armstrong lived, he would never do these things with me. He might not, she sobbed, even be all there, or like mentally all there. So they're worried that he might be like have a mental defect or something. He might, as long as he lived, lie on the rubber sheet in the center of the bed in the front bedroom, where the white marquisette curtains billowed out in the afternoon sea breeze, rustling like palmetto fronds. It was bad enough having an invalid brother, but having one who was possibly not all there was unbearable, so I began to make plans to kill him by smothering him with a pillow. Okay, that's pretty messed up. Now, remember, this kid is 6 years old, and it's written from his perspective. So, kids don't necessarily think things all the way through. But still, take note of that part of brother, the narrator, brother's personality. However, one afternoon as I watched him, my head poked between the iron posts of the foot of the bed. He looked straight at me and grinned. I skipped through the rooms, down the echoing halls, shouting, "Mama, he smiled! He's all there! He's all there!" And he was. So, mentally, he's all there. He's just a weak baby. When he was 2, if you laid him on his stomach, he began to move himself, straining terribly. The doctor said that with his weak heart, this strain would probably kill him, but it didn't. Trembling, he'd push himself up, turning first red, then a soft purple, and finally collapsed back onto the bed like an old, worn-out doll. I can still see Mama watching him, her hand pressed tight across her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. But he learned to crawl. It was his 3rd winter. And we brought him out from the front bedroom, putting him on the rug before the fireplace. For the first time, he became one of us. As long as he lay all the time in bed, we called him William Armstrong, even though it was formal and sounded as if we were referring to one of our ancestors. But with his creeping around in the deerskin rug and beginning to talk, something had to be done about his name. It was I who renamed him. When he crawled backward, as if he were in reverse and couldn't change gears. If you called him, he'd turn around as if he were going in the other direction. Then he'd back right up to you to be picked up. Crawling backward made him look like a doodlebug, so I began to call him Doodle. And in time, even Mama and Daddy thought it was a better name than William Armstrong. Only Aunt Nicey disagreed. She said call babies should be treated with special respect, since they might turn out to be saints. Renaming my brother was perhaps the kindest thing I ever did for him, because nobody expects much from someone named Doodle. So why is he named Doodle? Because instead of crawling around forward, he's on his hands and knees and he crawls around backward, just kind of looking over his shoulder, because that's just how he goes. So this is an important line right here. Renaming my brother was perhaps the kindest thing I ever did for him, because nobody expects much from someone named Doodle. So essentially, the narrator, brother, is saying nobody really expected him to do anything. But think about it. Doodle was supposed to die, and he didn't. He was not supposed to be all there, but he is. He was not supposed to be able to move, but now he's crawling around. So Doodle is defying every expectation. Kind of cool. Although Doodle learned to crawl, he showed no signs of walking, but he wasn't idle. He talked so much that we all quit listening to what he said. It was about this time that Daddy built him a go-kart and I had to pull him around. It's a picture of the swamp. At first I just paraded him up and down the piazza, but then he started crying to be taken out into the yard, and it ended up by my having to lug him wherever I went. If I so much as picked up my cap, he'd start crying to go with me, and Mama would call from wherever she was, "Take Doodle with you." He was a burden in many ways. The doctor had said that he mustn't get too excited, too hot, too cold, or too tired, and that he must always be treated gently. A long list of don'ts went with him, all of which I ignored once we got out of the house. To discourage his coming with me, I'd run with him across the ends of the cotton rows and careen him around corners on 2 wheels. Sometimes I accidentally turned him over, but he never told Mom. His skin was very sensitive, and he had to wear a big straw hat whenever he went out. When the going got rough and he had to cling to the sides of the go-kart, the hat slipped all the way down to his ears. He was a sight. Finally, I could see I was licked. Doodle was my brother, and he was going to cling to me forever, no matter what I did. So I dragged him across the burning cotton field to share with him the only beauty I knew, Old Woman Swamp. I pulled the go-kart through the sawtooth fern down into the green dimness where the palmetto fronds whispered by the stream. I lifted him out and set him down in the soft rubber grass beside a tall pine. His eyes were round with wonder as he gazed about him, and his little hands began to stroke the rubber grass. Then he began to cry. "For heaven's sake, what's the matter?" I asked, annoyed. "It's so pretty," he said. "So pretty, pretty, pretty." After that day, Doodle and I often went down into Old Woman Swamp. I would gather wildflowers, wild violets, honeysuckle, yellow jasmine, snake flowers, and water lilies, and with wiregrass we'd weave them into necklaces and crowns. We'd bedeck ourselves with our handiwork and loll about thus beautified, beyond the touch of the everyday world. Then, when the slanted rays of the sun burned orange in the tops of the pines, we'd drop our jewels into the stream and watch them float away toward the sea. So, really quickly, Brother is an interesting dude. So he mentions, well, a lot of things. And when he starts carrying Doodle around with him, he's just like whipping around the cart because he's trying to make it so that Doodle doesn't want to hang out with him. But eventually, he just realizes that Doodle loves him and wants to be with him all the time. So then he takes him and they start hanging out together. So how has Doodle and Brother's relationship already changed since the beginning of the story? That's your question. Take a moment to answer it. Okay, so how has Doodle and Brother's relationship changed? Well, they're becoming closer because Brother realized that Doodle, he isn't getting rid of him. So, let's keep reading. "There is within me, and with sadness I have watched it in others, a knot of cruelty borne by the stream of love, much as our blood sometimes bears the seed of our destruction, and at times I was mean to Doodle." This is a really important line, and so let's talk about it for a second. There is inside of me a knot of cruelty. So he's saying, inside of me, there is love, and there is also cruelty. Much as our blood sometimes bears the seed of our destruction. So what does that mean? Blood is what keeps us alive, right? It's what transports oxygen around our bodies. It's our life. And yet eventually our bodies get old and die. So maybe just because our bodies are imperfect and they eventually grow old and die, maybe our imperfect bodies are capable of loving, but also cause us to be cruel. So let's see how he was mean to Doodle. "One day I took him up to the barn loft and showed him his casket, telling him how we all had believed he would die. It was covered with a film of Paris green sprinkled to kill the rats, and screech owls had built a nest inside it. Doodle studied the mahogany box for a long time and then said, 'It's not mine.' 'It is,' I said, 'and before I'll help you down from the loft, you're going to have to touch it.' So Brother is making Doodle touch his own casket. 'I won't touch it,' he said sullenly. 'Then I'll leave you here by yourself,' I threatened, and made as if I were going down. Doodle was frightened of being left. 'Don't go leave me, Brother,' he cried, and he leaned toward the coffin. His hand, trembling, reached out, and when he touched the casket, he screamed. A screech owl flapped out of the box into our faces, scaring us and covering us with Paris green. Doodle was paralyzed, so I put him on my shoulder and carried him down the ladder, and even when we were outside in the bright sunshine, he clung to me, crying, 'Don't leave me, don't leave me.' When Doodle was 5 years old, I was embarrassed at having a brother of that age who couldn't walk, so I set out to teach him. We were down in Old Woman Swamp, and it was spring, and the sick, sweet smell of bayflowers hung everywhere like a mournful song. 'I'm going to teach you to walk, Doodle,' I said. He was sitting comfortably on the soft grass, leaning back against the pine. 'Why?' he asked. I hadn't expected such an answer. 'So I won't have to haul you around all the time.' 'I can't walk, Brother,' he said. Who says so? I demanded. Mama, the doctor, everybody. Oh, you can walk, I said, and I took him by the arms and stood him up. He collapsed onto the grass like a half-empty flour sack. It was as if he had no bones in his little legs. Don't hurt me, brother, he warned. Shut up, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to teach you to walk. I heaved him up again, and again he collapsed. This time he did not lift his face up out of the rubber grass. I just can't do it. Let's make honeysuckle wreaths. Oh, yes, you can, Doodle, I said. All you got to do is try. Now come on. And I hauled him up once more. It seemed so hopeless from the beginning that it's a miracle I didn't give up. But all of us must have something or someone to be proud of, and Doodle had become mine. I did not know then that pride is a wonderful, terrible thing, a seed that bears two vines, life and death. Every day that summer we went to the pine beside the stream of Old Woman Swamp, and I put him on his feet at least 100 times each afternoon. Occasionally I too became discouraged, because it didn't seem as if he was trying, and I would say, Doodle, don't you want to learn to walk? So keep that line right there in your memory. It's going to be important. He'd nod his head and I'd say, well, if you don't keep trying, you'll never learn. And then I'd paint for him a picture of us as old men, white-haired, him with a long white beard and me still pulling him around in the go-kart. This never failed to make him try again. Finally, one day, after many weeks of practicing, he stood alone for a few seconds. When he fell, I grabbed him in my arms and hugged him, our laughter pealing through the swamp like a ringing bell. Now we knew it could be done. Hope no longer hid in the dark palmetto thicket, but perched like a cardinal in the lacy toothbrush tree, brilliantly visible. Yes, yes, I cried, and he cried it too, and the grass beneath us was soft, and the smell of the swamp was sweet. So, Doodle, just like he's defied everything else in his life, maybe he can learn to walk with brother's help. So that's where we're pausing for today. A couple things to ask. First, how would you describe brother? His personality, who he is, and how would you describe Doodle? So how would you describe both of them? Use at least 2 sentences per brother. So 2 sentences for brother, 2 sentences for Doodle, 4 sentences. Okay, and then lastly, looking at the foreshadowing that we've seen, the mood of the story, what do you think is going to happen with brother and Doodle? So make a prediction. We'll finish it tomorrow in class. Hope that you've enjoyed it so far. If you have questions, hop back in the Google Meet. But otherwise, I will see you guys